Welcome and thank you for tuning in. My name is Fabiola Tosi and I'm the curator of The Frantic Desire for Almost Real, the exhibition on view at Chicago Artists Coalition from January 29th through March 11, 2021. The exhibition explores connections between identity, collective memory, and authenticity from the point of view of the displaced body. Today, I will virtually sit down for a conversation with artists Bryan LeBeuf and Darryl DeAngelo Terell on archives of collective memory. Our conversation will take a deep look into the work of these two artists, both originally from Detroit, specifically concentrating on their approach to modes of documentation and archiving of collective memories. The work of Bryan LeBeuf for the exhibition The Frantic Desire for Almost Real analyzes the condition of displacement intended as the effects of an environment changing around the body without its active participation or agency. Bryan speaks to this condition, looking in particular to the collective effects of displacement on Detroit communities. Through collective memory, displaced communities reflect on shared memories, moved by the desire to rebuild and restore their Detroit neighborhoods. Collective memory, however, is faulty and nebulous. Where memory reveals to be insufficient, archives are an essential repository of testimonies from a past that we as a community cannot always fully recall. Bryan LeBeuf is a new media artist working with 3D imaging, sound, and game design. His work examines community through collective memory, using overlapping experiences as a tool to rebuild and reimaging his neighborhoods in Detroit. Bryan constructs this environment from fragmented memories. Bryan holds an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Upon graduation, he was awarded the Toby Devan Lewis Fellowship, as well as attending the MANA Contemporary New Media Residency Program. Currently, Bryan is a Hatch resident at the Chicago Artists Coalition Residency Program. During this time, he is both working on an upcoming mobile game about the intersections of mental health and growth imbalance of work-life busy culture, while researching and fabricating works for future programming. Each upcoming work is being designed to further the realm of accessibility within a larger community, focuses on free downloadable content on all platforms. Darryl DeAngelo Terell is a Detroit-based artist who primarily works within lens-based media, photography, video, performance, and writing. They're also a curator, DJ, organizer, and educator. Their work explores the displacement of Black and Brown people, femme identity, and strength, the Black family structure, sexuality, gender, safe spaces for all Black bodies, and personal stories, all while keeping in mind the accessibility of art. Darryl received their Master of Fine Arts from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. They are currently a Red Bull House of Art resident, a 2019-2020 Document Detroit Fellow, 2019 Presley Arts in Detroit Fellow of Visual Arts, 2019 Artist in Resident at Northeastern Illinois University, 2018 Luminarts Fellow in Visual Arts, 2017-18 Hatch Project Artist in Resident at Chicago Artists Coalition, 2017 Artist in Resident at Acre, 2017 semi-finalists for the 80s Fellowship. They performed and exhibited work at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Museum of Contemporary African Diaspora and Arts in Brooklyn, New York, the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, X-Space Cultural Center in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, the Hunter Museum of American Art in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art in Scottsdale, Arizona, and the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. Thank you guys for joining me and for taking the time. Before we dive into your work, of course, I would like to start from your shared origins, since you were both born and raised in Detroit, and that clearly had an influence on your artistic practice on both sides. So I would like to know a little bit of your childhood in Detroit, what experience, and especially what experiences influenced you the most, you know, as an individual, but also as an artist. Um, yeah, Bryan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I guess. I think for me, uh, growing up in Detroit, at least on my end, like we bounced around a lot, mostly on the west side, and it was. Uh, but the thing that always was constant was with my other father and mom was music, music, music.
Mm.
So like D party or and like I had like R&B and house music from both sides, and uh, it was always in, it was always on. And then the other side of that was because my mom was a single mom and we did like there was no latchkey, there was no we didn't really like do after school events for like financial whatever reasons, but me and a couple kids in like every situation, video games. So like, which ends up kind of being a thread of like community and like also, I think starting to think about safe space and doing things like together and like kind of even like forging chosen family early on. Like I remember playing like Ocarina of Time, like Legend of Zelda, passing the controller around for hours, but also like because not everybody could like get every game, like, swapping and sharing games. So I mean, I think a lot of that ended up leading into my work. Usually always on the west
For me,
side.
I grew up on the opposite side of the city, right?
Yeah, we talked about this.
So I grew up on the east side. For most of my like childhood, both my parents were in the house until probably third or fourth grade. And then my parents got divorced, and separate households and like family drama that I don't feel like really digging into. But similar to you, music was a major part of the house. So my dad was a DJ. That was like on his side. That was one of his side gigs. Um, so with that, so like it's me. I'm the baby. Or at least growing up, I was the baby, and I have three older sisters who are like, I was born. All of them were teenagers when I was born. So it's like my dad was like chub rock with some bebop, with some like doo wop music, was like BB King, was Lauryn Hill. My mama was Lou Ross, Mahalia Jackson, Aretha Franklin, Tony Braxton, Whitney Houston. My sister Yvette is my oldest sister. She was the neo soul person, so she was Jill Scott, India Irie, Erica Badu. My middle sister was Vivian Green, DMC, and then my youngest sister was like all of the like hood music. So 504 Boys. She played like she played the music that you would not expect for me being 4 or 5 to be like in the backseat of her car with her friends as they're like smoking cigarettes, talking about like songs talking about explicitly fucking. So like that was my upbringing, right? When it comes to music. But then it was so funny because my personal style of music was very pop. So like I was the little black kid who was in the neighborhood blasting Britney Spears. Just imagine my big ass. I'm like blasting Britney Spears and blasting Christina Aguilera, and I'm learning whole routines, and I was that kid.
Oh,
So clearly to say my family as far as music style was very eclectic. We were all over the place. But I would definitely say growing up on the east side was really interesting because one, I'm really big. I've always been like a taller kid. I was a tall and skinny kid until I got to middle school. Then I became tall and fat. And then that like fluctuated. And then when I got to college, I was just like fat because everyone else had caught up to size. Not necessarily because I'm 6'7". No one's my height. But yeah, so like growing up in Detroit was difficult, was interesting, very much community driven. My mom was the type of person that everyone in the neighborhood respected her, and because they respected her, they look after me, even if we weren't in the neighborhood. Like if they saw me out and about, hey Darryl, do you need something? Like, hey Darryl, you good out here? You need a ride home? Do you need bus fare? It was very much community based, which I really do love and appreciate about Detroit, which is partially the reason I moved back in 2018 and why like I'm always in this state of flux on if I want to leave or if I want to stay. Um, but yeah, no, Detroit is home, yo. It's so beautiful.
Oh,
Um,
it is.
it's so beautiful. I love it. It's cold as hell right now. Apparently Chicago yeah, just got a really bad snowstorm. It skipped
Yeah.
over Detroit and
Which is rare.
it skipped over Detroit and then landed in New York City.
Like, never heard of that.
We didn't get nothing.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah.
So for someone like me who has not been to Detroit or is not super familiar with Detroit, can you guys talk a little bit about the difference, if there is any, from like the West Side, East Side experience? So like the neighbors.
I think if I was to start something, I think bigger that I've noticed mostly because Darryl, you moved back in 2018, right? Like, I noticed something, not so much what West Side, East Side, but like, so occasionally pre-COVID, I would go home to see my family on the West Side and a few people on the East Side. I think what is to me was always the most staggering was kind of like maybe the lack of difference to them when they were in both spots. When I brought people from outside of Detroit to both parts of the city.
See, wait, you're saying some people who aren't from Detroit when you
Yeah,
they don't know the difference.
yeah,
Oh, I can tell the difference in a point second.
yeah. So that's what I was bringing up is like I found it surprising, like when a few times I would come back home or the times I would come back home because it's so damn close. When somebody would come with me, like from out of town, or especially like we went to a pretty international grad program. And so friends from out of the country, when they would come with me, they would be blown away with all the staples of what people get affected by in Detroit, but they don't, I think there was the lack of realization behind, like by the difference. And that always fucked me up. Not to answer the question in a different way.
So there's historical differences between the East and the West. There's also racial differences between the East and the West. There's an economic difference between the East and the West. And there is a size difference from the East and the West. Redlining was a major, like had a major effect on Detroit and on Detroit economics. This is like the 50s and 60s, probably earlier than that. So pretty much post Great Migration, post the Great Depression, all of that stuff. Detroit was like hit, right? We also have so I love Detroit history, so I'm about to probably go into a tangent. I do apologize. So during the Great Migration, a lot of sharecroppers moved from the south to the north, right? So a lot of them moved to Detroit. On the east side of Detroit, we have a space called Black Bottom. Black Bottom is called Black Bottom because the soil is so rich that the soil was so rich that it was technically black. And due to the fact that the soil was so rich and black, a lot of the sharecroppers like found home in this space, and this is where they produced a lot of produce. 3, maybe 4 miles west of there, this is technically still the east side, is an area called Paradise Valley, which was, I guess you can say, Detroit's version of Harlem or Detroit's version of Broadway. So this is where all of the theaters were. This is pretty much like where Detroit's nightlife, entertainment life was bustling. Unfortunately, due to environmental racism, I-97 was planted in the middle of these communities. Yeah. So this is where the first American road freeway was planted, going straight through these communities, displacing a lot of people, right? That's the east side. Then we also have the 1968 race rebellion, in which we have the Northwest Side, or as some people know them as number streets, because all the streets are numbers.
Yeah.
The 1968 race riot or race rebellion, a lot of it started in this area, specifically at the intersection of Rosa Parks and Claremont. But there was also, what a lot of people don't know, was there's also a bit of it also started on the east side at the intersection of Cashew and East Warren. So like these two sides at the same time were dealing with police brutality and local Black people just getting fed the fuck up and like acting out. So like that plays a major part. And due to all, like, after all of that happened, the East Side also, of course, got hit really hard. Again, redlining, race rebellion, the freeway going through, a lack of infrastructure, a lack of resources. So like, I'm born and raised on the East Side. I'm a product of Detroit Public Schools. None of my grade schools are still standing. Every school I've ever attended is shut down, including my high school. My high school is now a factory on Van Dyke and 94, which pisses me the fuck off, because it was one of the newest built high schools on the east side of Detroit.
Yeah.
Designed by a Black architect. And there were no other schools within like a 10 to 15 mile radius. However, this school was shut down in 2011, 2012, which is ridiculous, right? So that plays a major part. So like when Detroit's favorite mayor or unofficial favorite mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick, in office, you thought I was gonna say Coleman A. Young, and
I thought, yeah.
No, I am Kwame Kilpatrick.
The real all-star.
The real all-star. So when Kwame Kilpatrick was in office, a lot of people, like, he brought a lot of great things. Granted, he was in a lot of embezzling. But it was like, once he left office, it's like everything kind of went to shit. Like, the school started getting shut down, like left and right. Like first thing we started to see was a lot of elementary schools getting shut down and being converted into charter schools.
Yeah, the charter school battle and public school battle. Yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, yeah. That, I feel like in the early 2000s, because a lot of friends and stuff that went to Wayne State, I had an unusual amount of friends that had ended up getting their teaching degree, and they were put to make like this really hard decision of like, well, I can't really, like, first of all, I'm not getting paid enough and there's no resources for DPS.
Mm-hmm. And
like, I'm getting X amount, but I know, like, infrastructurally, I am, by me moving in this space, I'm not only taking away somebody who wants to teach in these spaces and be in these spaces, but I am, like, kind of taking, like, an allocation of, like, knowledge and, like, interest in, like, in still being in DPS.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like huge. And you know, Darryl, when you said, like, you know, it's funny, like a couple weeks ago, I looked up, like, on Google Maps, just some of the old schools I went to.
They're probably they're still standing, they're just empty. Windows busted out.
Absolutely.
Trees are literally growing throughout the buildings because
absolutely.
Like they didn't have enough money to keep the schools open, so they shut them down. However, they haven't sold the buildings, so the city still owns these buildings, and they're not keeping them up. And which, to that, also adds a whole nother level of discomfort for community members to have, like, a 4-story elementary and middle school abandoned in the middle of the neighborhood, where it could be a potential risk for the community. So that plays a major part. Now, away from, like, a lot of historical and, like, social economical things about Detroit, culturally, it's also very funny and different. Detroit, we have our own little, like, inner city rivalry between the east side and the west side. People always call the east side broke. I call the west side fake as hell. There's, like, this beef, and it's an authentic beef. It's a loving beef. It's like, we can talk about Detroit amongst ourselves, but let someone from outside Detroit talk their shit, we may slap them. That's how we are about our city. It's great. I love it. I honestly, again, like I said, I struggle with the idea of wanting to move and then just be like, maybe I should stay here a bit longer. And then, like, maybe I should just stay here for the rest of my life. Maybe I'm gonna buy a house. I don't know. But yeah.
Yeah. I feel like we could almost like do an entire, and maybe we should at some point, we will, almost an entire other discussion on like the similarities between what you guys just described and, the story of Chicago neighborhoods.
Oh yeah.
There's like so much overlapping there. But I definitely want to, continue talking about, since we are talking about communities, like how your work intersect with that. And so like, both your art practices engage with this idea that communities are somehow repositories of this collective memory. And that is an incredibly important resource when we think about how agency and power structures are constructed. And so through collective memory, communities do have this sort of possibility of building futures by reconnected to their histories. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit how you approach that in your work and this relationship between, community, collective memory, and agency. And Darryl, maybe we'll start with you this time.
Okay. I think it's starting to appear in my work more in this new body of work that I'm currently building, right? And also brings me back to the conversation about like Paradise Valley and Black Bottom and like the intersection at Claremont and Rosa Parks, and thinking about these places as historical sites and how these sites hold a collective a historical significance to the collective Black experience of Black Detroiters. Um, so like Detroit being technically the blackest city in the country at 83% African American, or 83% Black. I just don't say Black because I don't know if it's all African American. So like the current work I'm making is really thinking about how this land can harness a power to produce a portal to get Black people free and away from the presence of violence. So like, that's where I'm at with it right now. And then there's another body of work um, that I've been working on since 2016, titled Project 20s, which is more so rooted in the displacement of Black and Brown people. However, that body of work actually does hop between Chicago and Detroit because these are the two cities I've lived in over the past 10 years. I lived in Chicago for 4 years, and then Detroit is home. Um, so that's how like I'm these collective experiences and this collective the collective history of both Detroit and Chicago do show up in my work. But then also even within my body work as Dion, I use a lot of Detroit cultural references, right? So people who are from Detroit or who are familiar with Detroit know that Detroit is a very braggadocious city. Like gator boots, Murray boots, fur coats, pinstripe suits, um, really long nails, ghetto jewelry, a lot of gold, big crazy hair, a lot of these things that I'm gonna be honest, it's very pageantry, it's very drag, if you ask me. So I use a lot of that collective experience within that work as well. So honestly, like Detroit is like this byline in all my work that's connected to some way, whether it's like a historical reference, a collective memory, a collective experience, or a cultural reference.
Bryan, what do you think about this sort of connection between, collective memory, again, communities, and how that can create
I
agency?
mean, I think for me, it goes back to like things in the last like few years. A place that I feel very at home in, and also with like formally in my work, but also with research, is like the library and archives, and like man, the Detroit Library, even like the one right near Wayne State,
Oh, there's my the main.
so beautiful. And I would like to take this moment. Like my last set of work wouldn't have been possible without Detroit Historical Society, and the great, like the great resource that is really any public library, mostly Detroit Public Library. I mean, because of the works about Detroit. But I think something that I'm concerned with is in my work, and you say about like collective memory and agency, is like who gets to deem what important enough to archive. Like Darryl was saying earlier, like first I'm from Detroit. I didn't know there was a second spot on the east side with the riots, and it's funny because like you can pinpoint almost any part of any neighborhood in Detroit and be like, the Industrial Revolution fucked them this way. Like, and it's both east side, west side, and there's something so like communal about that, like in a very sad way. Like same thing with the west side, 96, cut right through them, but I think for me, it's something that I'm trying to think through still. I'd be lying if I sat here and said I had answers, but I know what I want to do. And I think move forward, what I have been doing is I want to create all of these and the same things that I use to design like interactive technology and games and like interactive stories about Detroit, like in home movie, and then with the piece I did, the Lago Beachwood, which is it's right on the west side, right near Grand and Euclid, right near Steve's Soul Food and the Cadillac Body Shop. That whole neighborhood, which I've been taking scans and modifying technology to record these neighborhoods and design and take that data over the last handful of years and store it and offer it free and to be able to be used in a way to reference and a resource moving forward. So I think for me, it's about is a creator. I don't know, because I think I'm struggling with an idea of like creative space and art space and how those kind of most of the time serve as a wall, especially to like places that I grew up in. And they're not always very welcoming in a lot of ways. But if I can do anything while I'm thinking of these ways to work in these spaces or around these spaces, to adapt all these tools and to make things open source, but also try to provide as much data and give as much to these places that I revere so much. Which is why I fuck with a library. I love the Detroit Historical Society. I love to be honest, any neighborhood that has a historical society and has a group, you know what, they have a voice that I think is so undervalued in these micro histories, macro histories. So yeah, I don't know, agency in terms of archiving, I think for a long time has deserved to shift. And that's something I'm thinking about.
So I was actually thinking about, Bryan, what you were just saying in terms of, the archiving process, right? And who gets to decide what is important to archive. And one of the things that, we talked about different times, and it's interesting to me, is thinking about how, when you think about a neighborhood, a community, there is so much more than what is evident and what you can document with like traditional methods of archiving, right? There is things like the relationships between people in places, how people leave certain places, how they engage with the space, that it's much more ephemeral in a way, but it's also very important when you think back to the history of, of a community and how that community, leave their own environment. So I was wondering if you can talk a little more about this idea of how you can archive, ephemeral relationships or ephemerality with also the use of non-traditional media.
I think the best space is the most unlikely space usually, which is like the library, the box of videos in your neighbor's basement, because so like thinking about like for instance, in the last piece I did, there's a moment where it kind of talks about like that late 90 space in Detroit where there was that shift in Angels Night scare in Detroit. Yeah, Angels Night, Dennis Archer all day, right? And so that time, I mean, when you look at that time and that precarity and like them asking people to like police their own neighborhood, it's like that. I mean, in some of the PSAs, right? There's like that states like kind of like the failing of localized government, right? But it's not just in that video, right? That doesn't tell the story of the time. It's all in like kind of thinking about media in this sort of like Venn diagram with memory. So like when I think of that time, especially growing up on the West Side, I remember the sound of the bodega, walking a block down the street, seeing those PSAs, new dance party and like shows on public access. My dad ripping bootleg tapes to share with people in the building. Even like like right before you walk into the bodega, seeing bootleg DVDs.
After
Like
they're taped up.
absolutely. And it's about that time, it's like all of those things. It's the music that you were listening to, the music that was popular, that conversation that you may remember, or in some way there was a picture of it, of your neighbor's house. All of these things that kind of like pile up on each other are and fill in space, have a direct conversation with each other in terms of ephemerality and memory and archival processes that I fuck with, that I love actually. And yeah, it's something that's really powerful when all these things kind of work with each other to leverage a space.
Darryl, I have sort of a similar question for you, more specific to your work. Um, so in your case, looking at your work, I feel like the idea of archiving speaks much more to the process of creating narrative, sort of like a base for creating those narrative, so that you can tell these stories about, past, present, and eventually also future, if you will. Um, and I'm thinking, for instance, about, Project 20s, where you use photography to document the effects of gentrification on certain communities. Um, so the question for you is, how do you approach this idea of documentation and archiving through this work? And also, like, how do you feel that reflects or affects the communities that you work with? What is, the what what is the effect on your work on these communities?
And I feel like this is so cliche to say, but a lot of people are very anti-representation. But the idea of Black and Brown people being seen, being visible, is important for one. I feel like we're only seen or celebrated when we do something extraordinary, but we aren't necessarily seen when we are just we're just existing, right? So a lot of the times, people who have seen the work, and I'll be honest, the work has not been shown in Detroit yet, which is honestly driving me up a wall. But people who have seen it, it's definitely conversations about the process, why this specific process. They question where the idea came from. They question the sound piece that comes with it. They question my connection to gentrification. They question all of these things. And when I'm having conversations with them, it gets to a point where they're like, okay, it's meeting them where they're at versus hitting them with all of this damn art school or institutional jargon, which I feel like can be a barrier between artist, maker, and community slash viewers. I think I think that's really important for me at least. As far as like the process of the making and the archiving of it, it's poetic for me, right? It's like the act of doing it. And like granted, just to step back a bit, the language around photography is very connected to the language around a gun, right? So you have your trigger, you shoot, you capture, things like this. And whenever photographing marginalized communities, I shift the language. So I don't use shoot, I don't use trigger. I use like photograph. Like I like literally like use the words that I'm actually doing. So yeah, it's like the act of making is poetic. It's almost like a ritual, which I feel like a lot of archiving of blackness, of queerness, of otherness is ritualistic. Because honestly, we don't have much archival anything of these marginalized communities. Oftentimes, we don't even have photos that last for past 20, 50 years. Like, that's why I'm happy that we have spaces like blackarchive.co, in which they are archiving Black photos throughout the US. So, yeah, so I'm really thinking about that. Well, also, I'm going to be honest, with Project 20 specifically, I was really thinking about the daguerreotypes of the slaves that Harvard University has in their archives. You know, thinking about how those pieces look, how those pieces age, how they really like they feel historical, right? And like even with cyanotypes, especially once I tone them, you can't. I mean, you can tell by like the garments that people are wearing, but people who are wearing a simple T-shirt and no hat, you really can't You can't necessarily pinpoint what era it's coming from.
So I want to do something a little different this time. Not a question, but I found this little piece that I sort of wanted to read to you guys and then get your sort of like reaction and thoughts around that and how this kind of relates to your work and what we were just talking about in terms of archives. And this is something that I found by reading this great book that is Black Futures. I'm sure.
I have that book.
See, I was gonna say, I'm sure a lot of people just bought it this year, and it's a beautiful, it's just a beautiful work of archive, if you will, in and of itself. But so there is this piece by Ayanna Jamieson that it's strategies for building your own archive for the Black future. And I thought it was an interesting list. So I'll read it to you and then we can talk about it. So number one is keep a physical record, whether it is a conventional journal, a memory planner, a bulleted list of tasks, or a graphic vision board with commentary. It is essential to reflecting words and images that come from everyday life. Some people write down dreams, current events, or daily activities to revisit them later. Handwriting, doodles, drawings, and so on reveal things about ourselves that are not available in typed script. Number two is save ordinary artifacts. Ticket stubs, gallery guides, receipts, school assignments, canceled checks for paid bills, diplomas, greeting cards, thank you notes, and other things we collect through life are artifacts of our particular time, interests, existence, and experiences. We don't need to be published authors, artists, or famous to have historically relevant possessions. Number three is curate your life beyond and in addition to the algorithms of social media and digital existence. Regularly print out photos and playlists and transcribe recordings stored on shared electronically and or shared electronically in a way that does not require technology. Cloud storage, corporate media platforms, and hard drive storage may become inaccessible or obsolete. Cultivate affinity relationships with other folks. collaborate, engage, and designate stakeholders in shaping your shared legacy in the event of your absence. Do this with letters, postcards, events, virtual and tangible. Take photos, record testimonies, create artifacts such as zines and shared writing that communicate shared goals and aspirations for a communal inheritance. And then last is become familiar with inheritance and bequest requirements in your state or country. Create a digital living will to designate what happens to your social media content, emails, and other online accounts, along with your physical and intellectual property. So, what do you think about this list of 5 sort of, guidelines on how to create your own archive?
I think it's funny because I feel like it's just writing out what my community has been doing the entire time,
Yeah.
we're like, archiving the photos. A lot of people, like, one thing about Blackness is a lot of us are really big on oral history,
Mhm.
on exchanging oral history, and um, oftentimes we don't think about the act of recording, right, of video recording or transcribing. A lot of us are definitely thinking about it now as our parents are reaching older ages, or as our grandparents are like passing or getting ill and getting like in their 90s and 80s. But yeah, no, I feel like most of those things are things a lot of us definitely do. Other than the curate, I feel like a lot of us don't really think about how we share the material that we do archive, how we share the photos or the zines or the songs, the videos, things of that nature. Which is why I think it's important. Like, even though I feel like you don't have to be an artist, but this is why I think um, artists who work from archives are important, because we have the somewhat discipline or the understanding of how to build conversations amongst pieces. So like when I so like Bryan, when I think about your piece that you had in your MFA show, that's a lot of archiving. A
Yeah.
lot of it was coming from an archive. You curated this archive to produce a piece. So like and the act of you making that piece, you're actually curating. So yeah, no, I think a lot of that is it's something that we naturally do. This is like an unwritten, unwritten thing. I will say I do enjoy the fact that it's being written out. Because
Mm,
granted, this book is titled Black Futures, and the book just came out a month or two ago, right?
mm,
So now it's allowing younger people who may pick up the book to get an idea of ways of archiving for the future or for now. Because we got a bunch of scholars who are archiving the past, but who's archiving now and who's going to be archiving in the future is always my question.
Yeah, I think one of the things that strikes me about this piece, and I think resonates from my side to the work that you both are doing, is this idea of intentionality. Sometimes I feel like we, like as individuals, like we go through life, um, and we do some actions of archiving our, individualities and who we are and our lives, but most of the time we don't put intentionality into it. When you save, the Christmas cards, for example, that you love the most, you are archiving a part of your life, but you're not necessarily intentional about it. And so, how does that intentionality changes, the way that we consciously perceive ourselves, and what kind of power comes from that? I think that's a huge resource when you are intentionally, you know, leaving something behind about yourself. It also becomes a way to, leverage those power structures that we talked about in the beginning. For communities having, an intentionality and being conscious about, archiving their history can be potentially a way to regain that agency and restructures those, those power structures that for so long may have kept those same communities into a place of, um, um, almost to the side or hidden, if you will. And so that's why I thought this was resonating well with both of your works, because I see that intentionality in your work of, archiving things that relate to specific communities to be able to rebuild or build this potential futures. Well, I have one last question for you both. So I know you guys have known each other work for a long time. Um, and, I'm curious to know what kind of commonalities and differences you see in the work of, the other person. And then if in some ways, in, your history of knowing each other and knowing your work, do you see any sort of influences? Like, did you perceive there has been any influence of one another's work in your practice? Yeah. And also, most importantly, how do you think your shared origins impacted your art practice in like similar ways?
I think one thing that is connected through both of our work, honestly, is music, right? Detroit being Detroit being Motown, Detroit being the birthplace of techno music, Detroit being the home of, well, not necessarily the home. I use that word very lightly, of Eminem. But I feel like that is a very important and major part of being a Detroiter is music, is style,
No,
but
yeah.
also is work ethic. And I feel like both of us have these three themes that are that connect us as creatives, as artists from Detroit, as thinkers from Detroit, as people who are making about and around and through Detroit. I think about the rest of that answer. I'm gonna let you go say the rest of it.
Yeah, yeah, there is this like, I don't know, like work ethic tenacity that's very grindy, like that I find in like in Darryl, that I aspire to, and that I also I do myself, and I think there's this space of that I've been like, I think with some of Daryl's recent work, uh, for instance, the organization with printing some of your work on the billboards on throughout Detroit communities, I think I think it's so like directly um, talking. I think it breaks down like similar to what you were saying earlier. It breaks down some of like the jargon and barriers of art with a capital A, and really just like in your face in the space that I love. I remember I went back a while ago and I was like, it took me, I mean, I saw it on Instagram, but when I saw it in person, it was like a very real, kind of like large, kind of like emotional space where I'm just like, damn, like just when I went to see my family a minute ago, next to like our favorite abandoned soul food spot, Steve's Soul Food, and right near 96, there was two abandoned billboards just chilling. And then to have the juxtaposition and see that work was just simply like poetic and beautiful. And I think that tenacity, but also like
that visible space for like a Detroiter Black artist, it's like should have happened. And like not to kind of mix it up, but you said something before, and Darryl, we've talked about this before. Not to throw shade, but here we are. There is this like, I think there is this common space of like working in Detroit, around Detroit, about Detroit in different ways, but I think like culturally, like not showing in Detroit. And I think it's the state of like creative and cultural capital within cities and the lack thereof in Detroit. And we've had this conversation before, and that's another space too that it's just like when I'm in a space and like when I was going down the street and I was able to see your billboard, I'm like, damn, you're out here on the billboard, but what about in this gallery? Like,
Yeah.
that's a juxtaposition that I don't understand. But that's like a bigger qualm with like what art.
Infrastructure problem though.
Yeah.
It's definitely an infrastructure problem. Like I think like me and you again have had the conversation where being an artist from Detroit, like if you're not physically here, it's oftentimes out of sight, out of mind.
Absolutely.
And it can be very, very difficult to process because I'm gonna be honest, every artist I know who comes from Detroit, they're always making work that revolves around Detroit.
Absolutely.
Detroit is always an influence, a major inspiration, and maybe a major source, a major energy for their making. But it's the fact that like it's this feeling of being invisible while still working with the city that's really hurtful as an artist living in the city. So like just to add to that, like I've been in Detroit since 2018. It's 2021, and I rarely show inside the city. Granted, I've been blessed to like partner with Safe Art Space, which is where I got my first billboard from in spring of 2020. And then the current billboard I have up right now, Wayne State University, did it as part of a public arts exhibition that they had to readjust due to COVID because it was originally supposed to be a physical exhibition at the school's gallery.
Oh wow!
So it was originally supposed to be like an artist residency for a semester, and then ending with a billboard and artist talk. But due to the fact that COVID happened, things had to shift to work, which I'm personally okay with because I'm a big advocate of making work accessible, right?
Absolutely.
And granted, a lot of times these galleries are not super accessible due to their hours and so on and so forth. But having work in public, you could drive down Woodward at 3 a.m. and you're going to see art now,
Yeah.
I think that's important. But yeah, no, there's definitely a lack of infrastructure in Detroit that makes it difficult for artists to show. We also that's one thing I love about Chicago. While whenever I think about moving back to Chicago, I think about moving back to Chicago for these reasons. Chicago has a very strong artist-ran gallery community. Detroit does not.
Yeah.
Detroit has a very large primary art market, secondary art market galleries. Detroit does not. A lot of the art infrastructure, Chicago has Carrie James Marshall and Amanda Williams and Dawood Bey and all of these very legendary.
The list goes on.
The list goes on. And versus here in Detroit, we have a handful of artists who are celebrated to that degree. And some of these, and one of the artists being Charles McGee, who is elderly. The gallery that I work for, we represent his estate. He's elderly. We don't know how much time he has. Let's hope he lives for another 100,000 years. I always say that about everybody. Everyone's gonna live to 1,000 years out in my eyes. But we don't have these things. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I have a lot of hope for Detroit. I see the potential for Detroit. I celebrate with Detroit. And like in the act of celebrating Detroit, so it's something I also see in Bryan's work. Is this celebration of home. It's this celebration, this archiving, this spotlighting of home. Like, didn't you have like Good Morning Detroit or Hello Detroit?
Yeah.
And like some commercial jingle with Aretha Franklin.
Yeah, I found.
We have these themes, and
Yeah.
like the way that you approach Detroit historical like media in your work, I struggle with actually like sourcing like archival materials and using them in my work, and that's something I applaud with you, because I try and I'll look at it and this looks so damn ugly. I don't ever want this to be seen again. But then with you have this, it's like you have this chef kiss taste to it that really brings everything together.
Thank you. Yeah, and I feel the same. I like. I mean, your imagery is so beautiful, and to see, and again to go back, but to see it on the billboard is as, and now that we're past that of like the problem with infrastructure in Detroit, it makes me hopeful because you want to be you. I mean, as being from Detroit, you want to hope that that it's going to be different, you know, and like. I feel like a lot of artists that end up getting to be kind of big, they always kind of leave Detroit.
Yeah, well, you know, a lot of them have been moving back.
Yeah.
Because they're like, wait, I can get a studio in Detroit for $300 and
Absolutely.
buy a house and be able to still travel and don't financially struggle, and I can only live off working a part-time job making $25,000 a year and be fine. I'm gonna move back to Detroit. Fuck New York.
Yeah, it fucks me up.
Like, well, girl, I knew this ahead of time, so I just kept my. I got my degree and said, fuck Chicago. No, Shay, I love Chicago again. Chicago has a lot of infrastructure that we do not have. But
but you're not finding a studio and a house by yourself for $600. You know, like real talk.
Yeah.
And I think too, you know, like again, back to the space and images, even in some of like the earlier work, like the piece that you did, I think it was the video work from memory.
Mm-hmm.
That piece is kind of how I started my life, like in a similar way. Like I started with interviewing neighbors, just informally, like asking if we could record while like sitting on a stoop. Which, by the way, there's no good stoops in Chicago. But like sitting around, having conversations, and listening to music in my car because you have to drive every goddamn where in Detroit to talk about infrastructure issues, having to go see my friends and back to see my father. That's kind of how I started the project. And so when I saw that piece, it's a very like real emotional space that like, you know, especially growing up with family in a small house for me, like when I first was able to get a car, you know, like that is like this beautiful, safe place that so much happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, like especially a kid being in the city from the city, where even like a bathroom isn't a safe place. Like that drive, you know. So going from place to place, so much happens there, like a pool of self-reflection to release to incubator. So like I think with all that said, I find a lot of parallels, especially with that piece that still resonates with me. And like whenever I'm back in Detroit too.
Now you make me want to revisit that piece.
It's so, some of my greatest pieces and thoughts and ideas, even for like technology to develop, comes from driving to that whack drive from 96 to M10 jump on Michigan, like just because there's a freeway every damn place. It ends up being some of the places where I create some of my best ideas and work, but also just reflect and be. And I think that's why maybe a car and a space in a vehicle feels so different for me. And I feel it. And that's why that piece really makes me feel a certain kind of way. And I think it's me, like maybe a little projecting, but also it's a beautiful piece, especially a beautiful piece in that, whether we like to think about it or not, it's Detroit. You can't take that away.
So since we kind of like talked throughout about this idea of, archiving, also collecting memories, but to sort of like potentially also build these futures, what kind of futures do you wish for Detroit, and how do you see your artistic practice playing a part in it? Like as an artist, through your practice, how can you sort of like leverage that building of this future that you imagine for your city?
For me, the future of Detroit, what I would want to see the future of Detroit is for it to be a more equitable place, more equity, like because the way that a lot of the communities are and are struggling, to me, it just shouldn't be. So there's that. As an artist, I feel like I'm not gonna do. I'm kind of selfish and stingy with Detroit. I don't want people moving here. Keep the artists in New York. Keep their asses over there because what you coming here for? Keep your ass where you at. like that's where I'm at with it. Very protective of the city, but I do still want the city to be recognized as an art haven because the amount of talent that's coming out of the city. And I'm not even talking about just music talent because we all know Detroit is like bustling with music. But
Always.
the amount of talent that's in my building alone is phenomenal. So I really want for Detroit to be considered a haven for artists, a space for artists, a space where artists are here and thriving and growing and building. I on a less serious tip, I mean, I want a better nightlife for Detroit. I want to go see drag queens. I want to dance. I want to feel free because I'm a strong believer that with music and dance, these are acts in which Black people can find true liberation or a true form of temporary liberation. And with us not having a bustling nightlife, that liberation is not accessible to us, which is why I feel like a lot of people are so angsty. So I need for us to have a nightlife, an all-inclusive nightlife, also a very queer nightlife. There's a lot of things that I want for Detroit. It's be a whole dissertation. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think I want to second that, a part of that, which is like a more accessible creative space that isn't just in Midtown. But like, I think, Darryl, you hit it really strongly and directly, which was things, equity and division of space and money has to change. And like, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that looks like, but I want that so bad because I'm staying now part-time in Detroit, part-time in Chicago, and I want nothing more. I would like to see more accessible.
Someone said, "Come out, the Uber is waiting on you."
I beat twice. I'll do the long beat.
It's been 3 minutes. I'm gonna pull the fuck off. Come on. That was funny. I'm sorry.
real. Yeah, I think there's a lot of like, there's always been like a division of capital that's so stark. It's so real in Detroit. And I think that's the most hurtful part of like, even like, I don't know, when I was a kid, and it kind of like that border is kind of dissolved, but on the west side, when I would be taking a bus to school, and I would be go right through Grand and then make a right, and it would be like house, field, house, kind of like empty spot. And then you'd be like, there'd be a brief moment where you're in Boston Edison and you're like, what is this? And now those walls have kind of changed because it's just because of like the bar of terms of like division and accessible job and equity is like looks very different. Um, but I think, that has to change, right? And then, man, I would love to go see or be a part of um, art spaces, and there to be more resources and grants for not only curating but just developing and like preserving resources in all sorts of community. Detroit is big. Detroit
People don't know
is
that.
if you have not been to Detroit, well, first of all, if you're not from Detroit, it may seem small to you, but Detroit is damn big.
Yeah.
And there is so much that is uncovered and not looked at. And like I mean, let's be real, like forgotten. Um, and that's a problem. So if there could be grants and resources for cultural space, which it would be like self archiving and even just art engagement. I don't even know what the hell it looks like, but if there was some, I would be excited. And it's not only that; I think it's needed. Um, so that's kind of my long, confusing rant. That is like hopeful, you know. It can't just be from CCS, Wayne State, Midtown, and then like,
Cranbrook.
and then Cranbrook. Oh, first of all, don't even. That's not even in Detroit. So Cranbrook doesn't count. Sorry, Cranbrook.
No,
But like, there has to be more. No matter what, it can't be an echo chamber. And we're already seeing some stuff happen, and I'm so grateful to see your work popping up in spaces that, I mean, let's be frank and say what it is uh it's like an atypical space, and we would not say art there in the past, and to see that, I think that's hopeful. I think that's cool. I think so I'm hopeful.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. It was great to hear more about your work, of course, but also your experience in Detroit. Um, and I look forward to see more about, what you continue to work in the future. Um, okay.